Hello, my name is Tim Sandefur. I'm the Vice President for Legal Affairs here at the Goldwater Institute. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for our conversation with Dr. Ronald Lindsay on the issue of identity politics. Now, I'm going to give us a few seconds here for everybody to join the call because I know sometimes it takes a few seconds for people to come in. And please remember, in the meantime, that we will we'll be conversing, and then we'll follow that up with some Q&A. So if you have any questions that you'd like to ask, and you can drop that into the question box that's at the bottom of your screen. You'll see a little box there that says Q&A. You just type in your questions there, and we'll see them on the screen, and we'll get along to asking those questions as we go forward. I understand we have quite a lot of people joining us today because this is such an important issue. So I'm really glad that you all signed up and are participating with us. Once again, if you're just joining us, my name is Tim Sandefur. I'm the Vice President for Legal Affairs here at the Goldwater Institute. And this is one of our continuing series of conversations with writers of books that are of interest to the kind of work that we do and the kind of things that our contributors are interested in and that we think might not get as much attention as they ought to. So we've had, I think I've done maybe a half dozen of these now, and I'm really excited to be talking today with Dr. Ronald Lindsay. So let me introduce our guest, and we'll get right into it. Dr. Ronald Lindsay was for many years the CEO of the Center for Inquiry, which is an organization devoted to reason, skepticism, scientific values, the rational understanding of the universe. He is both a lawyer and a philosopher, if you can believe that. Of course, I find that easy to believe because all lawyers are inherently philosophers, whether they like it or not. It's just that 99% of them are very bad philosophers. But Dr. Lindsay is not. So he is also the author of this book, Against the New Politics of Identity, which is what we will be talking about today. I read and really enjoyed and published a review of this book some time ago. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Lindsay.
I'm very happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me. I'm very much looking forward to our conversation today.
So I think probably the easiest way to start would be just to ask you to define what you mean by identity politics.
Well, I guess I would say there are maybe two principal aspects. And maybe the most important one is the idea that a group identity, whether it's racial identity, ethnic identity, sex, sexual orientation, I mean, there are dozens of ways in which group identity now is understood. The use of that as a criterion for the distribution of government benefits, for hiring, promotion, layoff decisions, both by public and private employers, for the distribution of awards, including, for example, Oscars, for the allocation of grants, publication of research papers, school placement, college admissions, how healthcare is distributed, essentially all the different ways in which various goods in our society can be allocated. The politics of identity says that you have to take into account how those are distributed by these different groups. And of course, the ideology driving that is this idea that we have to have equity. And equity, of course, is social engineering that's going to be used to bring about equal outcomes for all these different groups. That's ideology now that has captured a lot of, the government. Biden's first executive order, in fact, stated that he was going to have a whole of government agenda with the idea that all government agencies had to take equity into account in formulating their regulations. And that has been true in various agencies of the administration. But as I said, it's beyond government. It's certainly driven away many colleges, many other institutions, many private employers address the various issues, whether it's admission or, as I said, personnel decisions. One other aspect of the politics of identity, which I'll talk about in the book, has to do with this claim that one's identity can determine what one can legitimately know. This is something that came about through the formulation of standpoint theory beginning in the 1970s with feminists who actually were borrowing from a Marxist doctrine. I say that not to cast aspersions, but because they said that themselves. And, Marx had this idea that the working class, the proletariat, had insight into the social structure of reality better than the bourgeoisie because they were blinded by, the idea that their dominance was natural. Well, the feminists took that idea and they said that, well, women, because they're oppressed, have a better understanding of social relations than men.
Right.
However, because the victim sweepstakes came about, and it just wasn't just women who were oppressed, but then you have racial groups, ethnic groups, the LGBT community, etc. So now there's this idea that people in so-called marginalized or oppressed groups have special insight into reality that the oppressors, which usually means white males, don't have. And in popular culture, the prevalent way this is usually cashed out is the idea that you have to give deference to the lived experience of people in these marginalized groups. If they say that something has happened or things should be structured a certain way, you have to defer to them because they have special insights given their status. So those are the two principal aspects of identity politics that I talk about in my book.
Yeah, one thing I really enjoyed about your book is that it doesn't stop at just the sort of superficial political level like a lot of the conversations on this subject do, and that you delve into the deeper philosophical aspects, the epistemology of it, the how people know things somehow is embedded in their racial or sexual identity or something. So therefore they have access to knowledge that we can't possibly have access to, which is such a profoundly anti-scientific and anti-rational way of thinking about the world. And yet it's remarkable to me that one of the changes we've seen in the past, 20 or 30 years has been this shift where, the left politically in the United States anyway, always tried to portray itself as the party of science and rationality. It was the party of secularism. And it seems like that's really shifted around. And so that today John McWhorter describes this kind of ideology as a new religion. What do you agree with that?
Well, it certainly has aspects of religion in the sense that it's very dogmatic, and it certainly won't, you know, put up with any kind of counter argument. And of course, it's situated in such a way because this claim about how the marginalized have special insight. Therefore, if you come up with some kind of argument against that, well, we can dismiss that because you don't know what you're talking about. You don't have the epistemic privilege, and that's what they call it, epistemic privilege that they have to really understand things. So it's a great way, really, if you think about it, to end debate. We don't have to listen to you because you really don't know what you're talking about.
I remember
Uh,
the first
and
time I
yeah,
encountered this idea was I think it was my freshman year in college, actually, when I had a teacher say that I was thinking in a linear logic, but there were other kinds of logics out there. And I asked her to explain how other kinds of logics could work, which she couldn't do. But, it immediately sort of set off alarm bells for me.
yeah, well, actually, and one of the things that actually prompted me to begin to write this book is you may recall a few years ago, the African American History Museum, which of course is part of the Smithsonian Institute, therefore it's a federal institution, uh, put up at the site, but also on its website, this so-called whiteness chart, indicating our culture had been influenced, the implication being negatively, by certain white ways of thinking. And they identified that some of the white ways of thinking was objective, rational reasoning, the importance of cause-effect relationships, and scientific inquiry. And I was, number one, really taken aback and astonished by that, in part because of how condescending it was
Yeah.
to people who are Black or Hispanic or whatever,
Yeah.
seeming to imply that what they can't apply objective, rational thinking and don't believe in cause-effect relationships. But yeah, it's unfortunately it's a way of uh, conceptualizing knowledge that I think is really pernicious and really undercuts true scientific inquiry.
And
And
like I said, it's so
like I said, it's so far.
condescending. I mean,
It is.
this in a city that was, Washington, D.C., that was laid out by a Black mathematician, Benjamin Banneker, who is remembered today precisely because he was so good at complicated rational thinking. And, so much for his legacy, right?
Right. And of course, if you examine this notion that there's no objective knowledge and somehow you have to look at people who are oppressed and they have special insight, if you examine that closely, of course, it's a house of cards. It all falls apart because obviously you have different marginalized groups, and therefore, well, so does a feminist have more insight than someone who's Black? How about a black feminist? Is they have more insight than someone who's a gay lesbian, who's maybe, or, a lesbian who's disabled or whatever, which becomes, then of course you come up to this notion of intersectionality. It's kind of a buzzword now that's very prevalent. You have to look at all the different dimensions of identity that people have. The problem is that then how do you cash that out? How do you compare, for example, the insights that a impoverished black lesbian has as opposed to a deaf Hispanic, in a particular situation? You can't, obviously. There's just simply no way to measure that.
Yeah.
So when you analyze it, it turns out to be completely worthless. And at the end of the day, of course, they have no empirical evidence to try to support this idea that oppressed people have special insights. There's certainly no evidence in the sciences that they have that.
Right, because of course empirical evidence is a white male construct, most likely.
Sure, right. Yeah.
One way that this plays out is in the concept of cultural appropriation. The idea that there's this ladder of hierarchy, and that people at the top should not somehow copy or imitate the ideas or the cultural creations or products of people below, because that's somehow a form of exploitation or expropriation.
Right. Yeah, it's ridiculous. You would think that it would be good for people from different backgrounds and different cultures to change ideas. I mean, that's one way in which we can progress and also can understand each other. But you're right, it's just ridiculous. I mean, and it extends throughout any type of area of culture, including if you're a white person that's trying to do Southern cooking or something. Well, no, you can't do that because that's maybe a black thing. If it's
Right.
depending on your recipe, and same thing with and it extends, of course, into acting. If you're a white person, oh, heaven forbid that you could try to take on a role that's not exactly white, or
right.
you
And
know,
of course, we're approaching Halloween, so I'm sure we'll hear lots of people saying and complaining about costumes, as happens every day, every year, unless people have just given up even doing costumes anymore. But
right,
the problem with the cultural appropriation thing, I remember some time ago, I was talking to somebody who believed in this cultural appropriation thing, and he said, well, there's an inherent, an intuitive sense where we see that it would be disrespectful, for example, to wear a religious symbol like a yarmulke or a cross or an Indian headdress in a mocking way, or a blackface minstrel parody or something like that. That would be bad. So why
right,
wouldn't appropriation be bad? And it struck me that there's a very big difference. Of course, there's a
sure,
cultural taboo against ridiculing people or demeaning
sure,
them. The reason we have this cultural appropriation idea come along now is because it refers to something else. It refers to not demeaning or ridiculing people. It refers to learning or copying from other cultures, which is what we should be doing.
exactly. You're right.
Well, one thing that I really enjoyed, I highlighted it in my book and wrote yes in the margin, was when you're talking about this equity idea. And you say here, no one has offered a convincing argument for the proposition that equal outcomes among identity groups is an overriding ethical imperative. And
No,
that's
yeah,
absolutely right. Talk a little bit
right.
about where does that idea come from?
Well, it's actually, I think if I had to trace the origins of it, it came about in part because of the notion that we live in a systemically racist society, and that's also now been, extended to not just to blacks, but to Hispanics, other groups, what have you, and maybe, also systemically prejudice against lesbians, gays, what have you, right? Uh, and therefore, to overcome that, we need to have a way of ensuring that there are all these, same outcomes for all these different groups. It's reflected perhaps most clearly in Ibram Kendi's, writings, where he says the only way to remedy past discrimination is now, uh, reverse discrimination. And part of that, of course, is social engineering, so that you try to bring out equal outcomes in all areas, whether it's wealth, whether it's income, whether it's access to healthcare resources, or what have you. And I think it's just such a misguided notion. First of all, it essentially inherently tramples on individual rights. And for me, at least, the proper moral unit of concern is the individual, right? The idea that somehow we should take the collective groups, and again, it's not just everyone at once, it's on a group by group basis that somehow you have to make these legal and moral decisions. I just don't see, the rationale for that. It not only does it not have a firm ethical rationale, but it's so unrealizable. I mean, first of all, you'd have to have a totalitarian society even to come close to do it. Because if you think about it, if your goal is to have equal outcomes, for blacks, proportionally for whites, and for Hispanics, and for, of course, all these other groups, whether it's lesbians, gays, disabled people, immigrants, etc., the type of tinkering the government would have to do to try to ensure that is just incredible. You'd have to have government intervention all the time. And then what happens, let's say, if miraculously, in all the different measurements by which you can kind of measure well-being, again, whether it's wealth, income, educational attainment, healthcare, et cetera, if one day all the groups proportionally had the same amount of wealth and income or whatever, what do you do the next day when it changes? You're gonna have to intervene again. It's, as I said, ethically, it's a very misguided notion. And it's also, as I say, unrealizable, certainly in a democratic society. So I don't
Yeah.
think that that people who are pushing this really have thought about the long-term consequences and what it would mean to society if we actually pursued this goal.
Yeah, Kendi, I mean, he doesn't use the word totalitarian, but I think
Yeah.
if you actually read what he's saying, he doesn't even deny that this would
No.
require effective totalitarianism. He calls for the creation of a federal anti-racism agency that would review absolutely everything for racism in order to protect people against and of course, this is by his highly
Right.
subjective definition of racism. It's really quite remarkable.
Yeah. Right. As
Well,
I said, the interesting thing is that even if, and some people have criticized this notion of equity and said, oh, it's like a Marxist notion. Actually, if you look at Marx, I mean, his slogan was to each individual according to their needs, right? Well, again, this is not to each individual. It's a group by group basis. And to me, that just has no ethical foundation whatsoever.
yeah, that's funny that you mentioned that, because that was what I was going to ask you is you often hear in discussions about identity politics on the right, when people are complaining about it, or wokeness, as they often call it,
Yeah.
they often refer to it as cultural Marxism. And you mentioned earlier that at least some of the early pioneers of this kind of thinking were in fact Marxists.
Yeah.
But do you think that it's accurate to call it a Marxist theory, or do you think that that's sort of become a misleading buzzword?
It is misleading, I think, because it's really, if you look at Marx, it's not really what he had in mind. Again, Marx obviously was mistaken about a lot of things, and his analysis of capitalism, what have you. His theory that the proletariat would be increasingly immiserated, what have you, clearly wrong. But uh, at least in some sense, you could see where he had an ethical argument. He thought the working class was being exploited, and to some extent, he was right in terms of England in the 1850s and 1860s. What he didn't allow for was, of course, the possibility of reform of capitalist society, which I think has taken care of many of the things that he was most concerned about. But again, at least he didn't have this idea of dividing society into these competing groups. So to some extent, I think Marx had at least a marginally better ethical background and ethical view than today's people who are pushing this equity agenda.
Yeah, in fact, I remember a couple of years ago, people were noting that the most effective response to the 1619 project was put together by a Marxist website that went out and interviewed the nation's leading historians and put some real analysis into their study of the 1619 project, which a lot of people, even people on the right, failed to do. Pretty amusing.
Yeah.
You tell this horrifying story in the book about Boston physicians sort of celebrating the fact that they were engaged in racial discrimination. I talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. Yeah. Why that's another thing that was an eye-opening thing to me, is to the extent to which the medical community as a whole has bought into this equity agenda. And if people haven't done this yet, I invite them to look at the the American Medical Association. In the past used to be regarded as a very conservative organization, was criticized on those grounds. Certainly not the case nowadays. So if you just look at their strategic plan for racial equity, it's astonishing the way in which they have refashioned the physician's role from caring for the individual patient to promoting their idea of social justice. And in doing so, they criticize, for example, what they call racial capitalism. They say that we should get rid of the malignant, that's their term, malignant narratives of individualism and merit. And it's just amazing. And that is carried over, has influenced, obviously, a number of physicians these days. So to give a couple examples, one you mentioned, these physicians associated with the Brigham and Women's Hospital, they did this study which indicated there was some statistical difference between Black cardiology patients and white cardiology patients in terms of how often they were referred to what's called specialized cardiology treatment as opposed to general admission when they went to the hospital. There was something like a 10% difference between the two groups. And they said, well, this is evidence of racial discrimination. And because we need to correct past inequities, and that's how they described it, this is a correction to past inequities, we have to make sure that there's preferential treatment actually given to Black cardiology patients. Well, first of all, I think that is suspicious in itself, morally suspicious. But the whole kicker of this is, you look at the study on which they relied, what it showed, it did show there was a difference, a statistical difference between the rate at which Black cardiology patients and white cardiology patients were referred to specialized cardiology services. That's correct. But as it turns out, the mortality rate for white patients, both those referred to as generalized admission and specialized cardiology patients, after 30 days was higher than it was for Black patients. 4% of the white patients died within 30 days versus 2% of the Black patients. So in terms of the actual results of what the referrals meant, it didn't have any effect on the mortality rate. Again, if anything, the whites died at a higher rate. So what that actually suggests is that the physicians who are making these referrals were doing it based on their assessment of what the patients actually needed. And that, in fact, the white patients who were referred actually may have needed that specialized cardiology services more than the Black patients. But in any event, based on this argument these physicians made, and this idea that somehow we have to correct past injustices, Brigham and Women's Hospital introduced a preferential admission treatment, essentially saying that, well, Black patients have to be preferred more often to these specialized cardiology services. When they did that, when they made that announcement, there was a pushback from various people who said, well, this is just plain discrimination. So they modified it somewhat. So if you go to the website now, and I just checked it a few weeks ago to make sure it's still up there, what they say now is that physicians, when they come to admission decision, will receive a prompt telling them they have to take into consideration the fact that this study showed that Black patients weren't referred as often, and they should take that into consideration when they make their decision. It is still the physician's decision, but Brigham and Women's Hospital will be keeping track of the admission decisions you make. So kind of a heavy hand essentially being placed on the scale. And I assume physicians who don't want to be accused of discrimination are going to take that into account. So that's one striking evidence of, this discrimination is taking place. But actually, maybe the worst one was this goes back to the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, when at that time there was a legitimate debate about whether healthcare workers or the elderly should be vaccinated first. And it's a legitimate debate because, the elderly were more at risk of dying, but we needed healthcare workers to stay healthy to take care of the patients, right?
Right.
So one could have made this argument, yeah, we should do healthcare workers first. But there was a ethicist, so that was how he described himself, at the University of Pennsylvania, who kind of just cut through that dilemma and said, well, look, let's look at this on racial terms. Most of the elderly proportionally are white. And because they've had, the benefits of better treatment throughout their life, they shouldn't get the vaccine. Instead, we should give it to the healthcare workers who proportionally maybe represent more minorities. So basically, as he described, this is a quote from him, to level the playing field, based on past discrimination that the minorities have suffered, we should prioritize vaccines for healthcare workers, which is, I don't know, it struck me as just a total distortion of a physician's responsibility.
Yeah.
And again,
No,
you can make,
and
yeah,
total distortion of justice
yeah,
too. But we'll punish the grandchildren for what their great great grandparents did.
right,
Is the attitude?
right. So
Uh,
it's, yeah, go ahead.
what I wondered if you had seen the recent New York Times article about the pushback that a lot of the DEI organizations are starting to feel nowadays, and there's this sort of sense, even among some of the bastions in the left, that the DEI effort has really not paid out and has turned into basically, nothing more than prompts on your screen, as you mentioned.
Yeah, no, it's good. And I think I'm hopeful perhaps that the DEI drive has crested and maybe there's a bit of a rollback now, certainly in some institutions. You may be aware, I think, I don't know if it was the New York Times article or another article, it mentioned that MIT, for example, is getting rid of so you probably know, many universities and colleges had instituted this program of requiring diversity statements from
Right.
people applying for faculty positions. Uh, and based on the rubric that many universities used, you essentially had to say that you were in favor of preferential treatment for minorities, in terms of how you're going to you treat other faculty members, how you're going to conduct your classes, whatever. In fact, you got negative points if you said things like all people should be treated alike, regardless of their race or ethnicity. That was counted as a negative in evaluating your diversity statement. Well, MIT decided they were going to do away with that. MIT also reintroduced the use of standardized tests, which again had been something, subject of a lot of criticism that somehow it's, discriminatory, what have you. And it's a symbol of white supremacy and, hurts the blacks, Hispanics, various other minority groups. Uh, Kendi, for example, in his book, one of his books, said that it was just a tool for black oppression. It was, in fact, maybe the greatest device used for black oppression. It was use of standardized tests. Of course, he mischaracterized it. He said it was demeaning because it suggested that blacks were less intelligent. But of course, standardized tests, as the people who used it, the SAT and ACT, they say this is not a measure of intelligence. It's a measure of readiness for college based on the skills that most colleges require to prosper in math courses or English courses, whatever. It's a readiness for college test, not a general intelligence test. And of course, the science bears out. It is a good predictor of how well one does in college. Not infallible, but generally a reliable predictor. So yeah, for a while, many colleges were doing away with reliance on SAT. But again, this is like MIT and another few colleges are reinstituting the use of these standardized tests, which I think is a good thing.
Do you I don't know how to phrase it. Do you have hope for the future? I guess is what I was going to ask. I
Yeah,
mean, do you think that? I guess this is two questions actually. I've heard a lot of people say that those who are on the political right or who are conservative or whatever, that their reaction against this stuff has been an overreaction. That they refer to it as a moral panic about wokeness. And it's true that there are some kind of silly exaggerations. There was somebody blamed that bridge collapse in Maryland on wokeness or something like this. And there,
right.
but do you think that there's been an overreaction on the right against this sort of thing, or do you think that we are starting to move in the right direction?
Yeah, two things. One, there was not, I think, an overreaction. I think it's a proper reaction to take regard this with a lot of concern. I mean, because the extent to which it has permeated so many different institutions, the government, private institutions, uh, I cite in my book various companies who said they were adopting this equity agenda in terms of hiring, but also layoff decisions, right? That they, if not based on the qualities of employees at the time, but whether they, affected minority groups more than whites. Twilio was one company that, when they had layoffs recently, said they were going to use an equity agenda. So it permeated many different layers of society. And I think there was reason to be concerned. I mean, it influenced scientific research. I mean, various scientific journals stated Nature, or one of Nature's sub-publications, I forget which one, said explicitly they were not going to publish any article that they thought reflected poorly on, uh, you know, minority groups, that somehow demeaned them in some fashion. Well, essentially, that's saying we're going to cut off scientific research, even if it's valid, if somehow it will affect negatively uh, certain racial or ethnic groups. So I think there was a legitimate reaction to it. Now, as I said, maybe it's in some areas this drive for equity has peaked. You see it, as I said, in some colleges. Whether that actually institutes a real rollback or not, I think a lot depends to some extent on perhaps this upcoming election. As you indicated, I think in some conversations we had, this is not a great choice we're facing right now for various reasons. Uh, But if Harris is elected, I assume she's going to continue with this equity agenda. I mean, I know she's trying to distance herself from Biden in certain fashions, but I don't think she's distanced herself from Biden with respect to this thing. And again, the first executive order that Biden issued was an executive order that all government agencies had to take equity into account, and they certainly have, based on a number of different decisions. I think the most recent equity-minded executive order that came about was something to do with artificial intelligence, where there are various arguments as to whether AI should be regulated and how it should be regulated. But one thing that the executive order Biden administration issued was that somehow we have to take equity into account, that we have to regulate artificial intelligence so that it promotes equity. Why? I mean, why should we do that? What is the ethical imperative that says we have to regulate AI in that fashion? So, I don't know if it's cause for being, optimistic. I guess things may be a little bit better than they were maybe a year or so ago, in the sense that some private institutions have decided, yeah, DEI has really been overplayed and it's not the way we want to go. And we can be fair in our missions and certainly take into account people's backgrounds when they apply for college or what have you, without throwing out all these tests that we use, or having DEI bureaucracies that are 10 times bigger than our faculty.
Yeah, right.
All right.
Well, we've been kind of picking on the left a little bit here. Let's pick on the right too, because you
Yeah.
end your book with a section on how the identity politics works on the right by fostering this notion of white Christian nationalism that teaches that America is a country only for white Christians and so forth. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, I think that I mean, that there's always been that political element on the right that has, had that vision. But I think it's been, you know, energized now to some extent by this reaction against the equity agenda, the push that they see for advancing minorities at the expense of whites. And I think that's definitely true. I mean, the rhetoric that's coming out now is much more explicitly Christian nationalist than it was, say, back in 2016 or 2020. I think just the other day, Charlie Kirk, I think he's the head of Turning Point, came out with a speech in which he said that the Democrats, their whole agenda is anti-Christian, and we need to have a Christian nationalist viewpoint, and Trump is the way to achieve that. So I think it definitely has, as a reaction, I think, to some of the excesses on the left, we're seeing this push now on the right for a Christian nationalism. And in my book, I talk not so much about how horrible those policies would be if they were actually enacted, but just the historical underpinnings of it, right? Which I think, if you look at the history, it doesn't support this idea. One of the driving forces behind Christian nationalism is that the founding fathers wanted to create a Christian nation, and somehow we've gotten away from that vision. And I think if you examine what the founders intended, especially if you examine the Constitution, which after all is the founding document for our country, you can see that there's really no support for that. This is the Constitution itself is a very secular document. There's nothing in there to indicate whatsoever that the government should support religion, let alone Christian religion. In fact, the only clause in the Constitution that addresses religion indicates that there's supposed to be no religious test for any government office. There's no invocation of God, let alone Jesus Christ, in the Constitution, as there is in constitutions of various other countries. So I think that the argument, fails. And what they often point to is the fact, they're obviously a number of the founding fathers were Christians. Certainly, I won't deny that. But that doesn't mean they didn't recognize the wisdom of having a government that did not interfere in religious matters. I mean, as a background, they were very well aware of all the wars of religion that took place in the 1600s and 1700s, and all the divisiveness that caused, and how disrupted countries led to a lot of bloodshed. They were very well aware of that, and they didn't want that to happen in the United States, so they created a secular government. And then the other argument that Christian nationalists make, they look to earlier documents, whether it's the Mayflower Compact or the General Orders of Connecticut, which do have language in there referencing Christianity. One problem with that argument is that it is kind of ignoring, that was 150 years before the Constitution was written. Things changed in that 150 years, right? I mean, the intellectual environment changed quite a bit. So you can't rely on something that was written in the 1600s as somehow as evidence that the United States was founded as a Christian nation. So I spent a lot of time in the last part of the book kind of undercutting the historical underpinnings of this Christian national argument.
Yeah, you mentioned the intellectual environment. Of course, the term that we use to describe the intellectual environment of that day was the Enlightenment, and really
Right.
kind of the theme that runs throughout your book and a lot of other writings on this subject by a lot of really good scholars is that what we're witnessing is an attack on the Enlightenment legacy. And the 18th century, 17th and 18th century Enlightenment was an effort to bring reason to bear on social and human institutions, on politics and other things. And what was amazing, what was beautiful about that is that reason is accessible to all human beings. It isn't bound by cultural and racial backgrounds. You can read, Plato, who lived centuries before, Cicero in a completely different country. And then you can read Cicero and see how he agrees with Plato. So there's some truth there. And then you move forward to Aquinas, and he's talking about Aristotle. And these intellectuals live in this sort of timeless realm because they're talking about ideas that are valid or invalid at all places and in all times. And so they're human values. That was what the Enlightenment strove to accomplish. And now what we're doing with this racial politics is shattering that legacy by saying everything has to be bounded by your racial background, your cultural background, and so forth.
Yeah, and exactly that. And that is, as I point out in my concluding chapter, that's actually what unites the right, the Christian the nationalist right, and the left. They're both enemies of the Enlightenment in different ways. And I think if we're going to preserve our democracy the way we want to preserve it, we have to get back to Enlightenment values, because that's really what the country was founded on. That certainly was a huge influence on the founding fathers. They were very well the Enlightenment thinkers, like Locke, etc. And that was the underlying philosophy for how they decided this country should be run.
Yeah. So what has the reaction to your book been so far out there in the public?
Well, unfortunately, the sales have not been as great as I would like, somewhat anemic. Those who have read it, I mean, the reviews have been very good for it. Interestingly, I've gotten some pushback from people who I regard as friends or what have you. And I think it's an unfortunate side effect of partisan politics we have now. Everything is so polarized. The idea now is that, if you're against Trump, well, you have to against everything that, Trump or maybe some of his supporters may say. Then obviously some of them do criticize, the equity agenda on the left. And that's something I agree with. Doesn't mean necessarily I'm buying into the whole Trump thing, but people who've been my friends, people on the left, and again, I work for the Center for Inquiry. they're an organization that promotes a humanist outlook, and probably many of the members are somewhat progressive or leftist in their politics. Not all of them. And they have said, "Oh, gee, you've gone over to the right wing, you've gone over to the dark side, or whatever," because if you're criticizing the equity agenda, you're echoing what some of the Republicans are saying. Well, that may be true. Maybe I'm echoing what some other Republicans are saying, but if they are criticizing the equity agenda, they have a point. And we should look at, if you're a reasonable person and if you believe in the Enlightenment values, you need to look at issues on a case by case basis. And where you think there's a flaw in reasoning, where you think an argument doesn't have merit, you should point that out. That's how we advance ourselves as a country, right? If we put ourselves in these partisan silos and say, well, everything the other side says is wrong, and we have to reject that entirely, and we have to stick with our team, right? It's our team versus the other team. Well, that bodes what it doesn't bode well for our country. And it's true. There is an excessive partisanship in this country at the moment, and polarization. And that is a shame because if we're going to, whatever the outcome of this election is, uh, if we're going to advance, we need to have compromise. People have to see some of the reasons and what the other side is saying. There may be something to that. We have to take that into account.
Well,
My
Steve,
hope, by
this
the way,
was
for this election is actually we get divided government. I
yes.
think that's the best way that to ensure that the extremes on either side can't prevail. Of course, it's kind of hard to bring that about, but uh, we'll see. Uh,
Our constitutional system was built on the principle of separation
yeah,
of powers and checks and balances, and we are almost always better off with
yeah,
government being divided in such a way that the media cries and screams about gridlock. Whenever they're crying and screaming about gridlock, it sounds like music to my ears.
right, right. Because all the essential things eventually, whether it's funding, making sure the government is funded, people eventually come around to that because they recognize that's essential. And I think compromise, is a good thing.
Yeah. Well, we'll get to some viewer questions. If you have any out there, we'll just type them into the Q&A box there at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to answering some of your questions as we go forward. But you mentioned earlier the uh, race politics executive orders. That's the term I'm looking for.
Right.
The
Yeah.
executive orders that the Biden administration put out on these things. The one that's really stood out to me as the most extreme was the one about indigenous knowledge. Have you seen this one?
Yeah, I haven't memorized it, but I've seen it. Yeah, that's another thing that's become a symbol for the equity and ideologically driven left. Yes, that somehow the indigenous have special insights into things, and we should take that into account.
And this
Uh,
thing is
yeah,
so long, it's like 40 or 50 pages long,
yeah,
and
yeah,
you just, I dare anybody out there to try and read it and tell me what it says. There's so
yeah,
much gibberish jargon in there about other ways of knowing, and we must take these
yeah,
into account. What does take into account even mean, let alone it's totally
yeah.
incomprehensible. And I guess that's one advantage that the pro reason side of this argument has, is that at least what they say makes grammatical sense.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, well, there is this whole indigenous shtick now, if I can say that, this idea that you see it now, of course, in the land acknowledgements, right? That
Right.
so many institutions have, right? Especially universities, they have some kind of ceremony, graduation ceremony, whatever. They start off, well, we say that, we have to acknowledge this is on stolen land, whatever, which is a premise I'm not sure I agree with. Look, I mean, obviously, many of the indigenous were poorly treated, right? That's a fact. Whether the land was actually stolen or not, depends on the different circumstances. Each, again, as a generalization, you have to look at each history of each tribe and their relations with the government at the time to determine whether the land was actually stolen or not. And you know, one of the things is often overlooked because say, well, these were the original inhabitants of the land. We have to defer to them. Well, if you look at the history of the indigenous, pre-Columbian indigenous, they were taking lands from each other all the time. I mean, they were fighting among themselves. I mean, who were the original inhabitants? The original inhabitants, probably of the Americas, they were in existence at the time that the Europeans came here because they had been defeated by successive, waves of people coming over. Uh, Certainly, the Mexico or the Aztecs, as they're somewhat, sometimes called, when they went into central Mexico, I think they weren't necessarily kind to the tribes they overcame, and they took their land. So, who are the original inhabitants? It's again this it kind of a misreading of history, which is just being used for ideologically driven purposes. It's a kind of a tendentious narrative, I think. Again, just tied in this whole idea that white supremacy is somehow the root of all evil.
Yeah. I here's a question for you: is in addition to your book, what would you recommend that people read to get up to speed on these arguments, on their origin, and their logical flaws?
Well, there's a book that came out a few years ago and actually sold pretty well. I think at one time it was on the New York Times bestseller list, at least briefly. It was called Cynical Theories.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure the full title. It was written by Helen Pluckrose in addition with James Kennedy, and it actually gave a kind of a uh, historical overview of how some of these theories, especially we talked about the theory of specialized knowledge that marginalized groups have, how they came about, how it kind of grew out of the both feminist theory and postmodern philosophy. I think that's a good introduction to, again, at least this idea that marginalized groups have a specialized way of knowing. Uh, Books by John McWhorter. I forget he came out with a book a few
Yeah.
years ago, for exactly title. Uh, and that's interesting. I mean, there are many Black scholars who've come out with criticism of these ideas. And that's actually one thing I want to mention, by the way. One thing that's taken root in our culture, and again, this is I think part of the drive behind the whole equity agenda, is this notion that systemic racism is taken hold of our country, and we have to root it out. And as you know, I devote a chapter in my book to kind of analyzing that argument and to showing that, in fact, at best, it's unproven. There may be some legacy effect from obviously, the slavery that, many blacks had to endure, and then the discrimination that took place up until the 50s and 60s. But certainly from the 50s and 60s on, the notion that our laws, our regulations are systemically racist is just false. I mean, obviously we've had all the Civil Rights Act, both first initially at the state level, then at the federal level in the 50s and 60s. Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, the Credit Opportunity Act. We've had affirmative action for 50 or 60 years. I know that's been cut back, at least in theory, by the Harvard decision, at least as it applies to colleges. But still, we had that for decades. The social welfare programs have disproportionately benefited minorities. So if you're looking at statistical arguments, certainly have to take that into account. So this idea of systemic racism as something that is prevalent today in our society, I think is unfounded. As I said, it's at best unproven, and I think it may be uh, completely misguided.
One thing it just kind of occurs to me is that let's steel man this argument, as they say. Let's make the best possible argument we can for that position would be to say that it's that the legacy of racism was that 50 years ago, 75 years ago, whatever, people were unequal as a result of then accepted racist legal institutions. We get rid of those legal institutions, but the people are still unequal as a consequence of what occurred, and then they retain those inequalities. Their children are born unequal and so forth, and so the inequality kind of persists even after you've removed those barriers. But that argument, it seems to me, is actually an argument that racism is not systemic, but exactly the opposite of that, that it's non-systemic racism, that it's sort of this dispersed non-pattern sort of you might say random racism scattered throughout society is what that argument really is. So that makes it harder to cure, for one thing, because then you're talking about fixing it on a case-by-case basis not with one-size-fits-all legislation. And it makes it harder to say, well, this is the fault of the system, the man, the establishment, which we now call systemic.
right.
That would be a much better, much stronger argument to make. And yet that's not the argument that the advocates are making.
No. And as I said, there is, so just take the example of inequality in wealth, which is one of the things that people who talk about systemic racism focus on. And it is true if you look at the average, the median wealth for white families versus black families, there is a disparity there. And some of that probably can be traced, and there have been some studies I cite in my book. Some of that inequality can be traced to, again, to the legacy of past discrimination. But there are other factors at play that, the people who advocate for systemic racism never mention. And one of those is family composition, which clearly has a
Right.
huge impact on wealth accumulation. And, the fact of the matter is that the prevalence of single parent families among blacks is much higher than it is among other groups. 64%, I think that's right. I'm trying to remember the statistic I saw in my book. 64% of children, black children, are in single parent families. And that obviously makes it much more difficult to accumulate wealth. And that's shown by the fact that if you compare two-parent black families with single-parent white families, well, two-parent black families have greater median wealth than single-parent white families. So it's certainly a key factor is, are you in a two-parent family or a single-parent family? And that is something, again, this is not a moral judgment. I'm certainly not criticizing people. If people want to have, 1, 2, 3 children as a single parent, that's their decision. We respect the right to bear children in this country. But you can't turn that around and then try and parlay that into an argument and say, well, look, this is, white supremacy causing systemic racism, and that's why we don't have the same wealth. There are clearly other factors at play. And as you say,
Yeah.
when you point out, if you take the legacy, you know, argument into consideration, I think there's something to that. It does mean we have to certainly look at how exactly do we, if we want to eliminate this wealth gap, and there's some reason we should do that, because I think a stark inequality among racial groups is not healthy for society. So if there's some way to do that without violating individual rights, we should look at that. But just through denunciations of systemic racism and then these equity policies where you try to say, oh, we have to have a balance of people going to college and the same, proportion of people have to graduate from college, and then the same people have to be hired into these jobs, that's not going to really address the underlying problem properly.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and it became without addressing the underlying philosophical problem that gives rise to all these fallacies, which, as you said before, is this notion that unequal outcomes is the same thing as injustice, and
Right.
those are two different concepts. And I think what I encounter, in fact, I was just speaking at some law schools in Pennsylvania this week, and you talk to students and faculty, I'm sorry to say, and you experience time and time again just this default assumption that if there is an inequality, it must be as a result of injustice. And
Right.
yet that connection has never been made philosophically. Nobody has really. The only person I can think of who has tried to make that argument is John Rawls, and his argument, I think, is quite obviously weak, and
Right.
yet
Yeah.
that it's
Right.
become dogmatic.
Right. Yeah. Well, the whole systemic racism argument is based on statistical disparities. That's their evidence. If there's a statistical disparity in whatever that is, educational attainment, access to health, resources, wealth, what have you, that is in itself, without more, evidence of systemic racism. And obviously, that's a fallacious argument. I mean, again, I point out in the book, statistically, if you look at, for example, professional sports, you have this huge disparity among Black and white athletes in basketball, football, many other sports. Does anyone claim there's discrimination at play there? Right, that whites are being discriminated against? And again, these are very highly paid positions. Athletes make literally tens of millions of dollars a year in some cases. So these are not, poorly paid positions. But no one's saying, well, there's discrimination against whites. No, everyone assumes it's based on, criteria of merit.
Right.
So certainly the fact there's some statistical disparity in itself doesn't show that there's discrimination. You have to have some kind of cause-effect relationship. And again, that's what is lacking in most of these arguments for systemic racism.
There's one of the questions in the chat box asks whether you think that the identity politics argument is being put forward in a conscious effort to undermine the foundations of the United States.
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think the people who buy into the identity politics are sincere and they think that there's an injustice going on and they want to correct it. I don't think that's, yeah, I don't see it as a way. They have a different vision, maybe, of how the United States should be structured. That's certainly true. They certainly think that a collectivist vision may be allowed to trump individual rights in a number of cases. So, and I think this is for all the reasons we discussed. I think that's very misguided, and I think ethically flawed. But I don't think that it's certainly not a conscious effort to undermine the United States. It's just a different vision of how the United States should be structured.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I think there's a lot of factors, like you were saying about racism. There's also a lot of factors that are in play in this issue too. I think there's a lot of reasons why we saw this stuff kind of crop up in the past decade. I think the George Floyd killing was obviously a
Yeah,
huge part of that. People were so horrified by that that they kind of rushed to find some way to show their outrage and register their protest. And unfortunately, in many cases, they were rushed right into the arms of people with these terrible ideas. And then
right.
COVID was monopolizing everybody's attention. And I just think there's a lot of reasons why you see this stuff really cropping up in the past, because none of these ideas are new, right? I mean, there were
Right.
people making these arguments in the 60s and 70s too.
Sure, sure. Yeah, right. Yeah. I mean, it has, I guess, progressed in its intensity over time. But you're right, it is interesting. And I think at some point, and I don't think we're far enough away from it, it is interesting how the George Floyd incident somehow was the match that, hit the tinder that was already
Yeah.
there. It caused this thing to really come to a head. Because, yeah, overnight, institutions were falling over themselves to institute DEI policies, to colleges especially, you saw that. So, but it was already there, and it was generating, germinating. But the Floyd incident brought it to a head, and it's
Yeah.
kind of interesting how that won. I mean, it was, you know, a gruesome video to watch, obviously, to see someone's life being slowly extinguished. Uh, but yeah, and then of course people took that as, oh, that by itself indicates, police brutality and, law enforcement is prejudiced against blacks or what have you. And you've had all this rhetoric over the last few years, how there's a genocide of blacks through police killings. And again, the facts don't support that at all.
Right. Which is not
Yeah.
to say, of course, that there's not racism out there or that there's
No,
not,
no,
unjust laws out there or anything like that.
sure,
It's just saying that
no,
the broader, more ambitious claims of the identity politics theorists just aren't borne out by logic or the fact. See, this is the reason why you haven't sold as many books as some other people, is because you keep insisting on logic and facts instead
right.
of acting like a crazy person on Twitter, which apparently is how you sell lots of books. So.
Yeah, right. And also, I think, my publisher told me that one problem you're going to have is that you criticize both the left and the right. And he said, you got to take a stand one way or the other if you want to sell books.
Right.
And I just said, well, I can't do that. I can't be intellectually honest and do that. And he said, okay, we'll publish the book, but yeah.
Well, what? Let me
And he
just
turned out
ask
to be
you, if
right.
you're not, if this isn't too much to ask, what do you call yourself politically? Would you call yourself a left person politically?
I consider myself a classical liberal. I
Classical.
believe very strongly in individual rights. And, to some extent, that has pushed me more often than not to support Democratic candidates because they're the ones, I am in favor of reproductive rights, and meaning that the right of a woman to choose whether or not to have an abortion up to a certain period of time. I don't know if we're going to lose that level of detail or not. I'm in favor of assisted dying. I actually wrote my PhD dissertation on that, on the morality and legality of it. Uh, I've been in favor of same-sex marriage even before that was, a position that most people, adopted. So I'm in favor of individual autonomy and individual rights. But because of that, that's why I was so, I guess, taken aback at the turn by many on the left to this embrace of this identity politics, which to me is antithetical to the ethical position that we should give the rights of the individual priority.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining me, Dr. Lindsay. It's really been a pleasure to talk with you. And let me encourage everybody out there to get and read his book, Against the New Politics of Identity, with a really interesting combination of philosophy and politics and law and history about these ideas of racial identity and sexual identity and all these identity notions that are going on out there. And very concise too. It's not like a huge tome. So I think you'll all enjoy it. And I also thank you so much for all your years of work for Center for Inquiry. I really have always admired the work that they do and the publications that they put out and their commitment to rationality and science in a world where those values are much too often overlooked. Thank you very much again for joining me.